Good afternoon, everyone. I want to let you know first off that I'm pissed off. And you know why I'm pissed off? Because for the first time in my life, I bought a brand new car last month. And this morning, before I came here, the mail ran early, and my license plate arrived, and it was not one of the license plates that announces the 200th anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans. So very disappointed with that. Anyway, personal feelings aside, now let's move on to the main topic. The Battle of New Orleans is not just one action that stands out by itself. It is but a part of a larger constellation of activity. And this activity takes place over a stretch of coastal littoral stretching from Apalachicola Bay all the way to Barataria Bay here in Louisiana. A box that is 300 miles long that was punctuated by a series of actions that began in August of 1814, stretching all the way until after Valentine's Day 1815. What we do, and what we tend to traditionally and typically do, is emphasize one point of light out of the 1,000. We emphasize one moment out of all of this. The main memorable action, the January 8th, 1815 Battle of New Orleans. Still don't know what to call it. The main Battle of New Orleans, there were multiple, there were many. But a point that I would like to make, just to get the conversation started, is that the January 8th, 1815 battle is but one point of light out of 1,000. A number of things happen. We tend to, by emphasizing January 8th, we tend to overlook things that happened prior to January 8th, and then, importantly, we also overlook things that happened after January 8th, within this 300-mile-long box. And why has that come to pass? Why is it that we have come to develop such an acute focus on one day out of hundreds? Why is it that that one moment has captivated our attention so thoroughly? Well, I blame it on the song. You all know it and you all love it, don't you? And you could probably all sing every last word with me, couldn't you? 1814, we took a little trip. Long Colonel Jackson, I'm not even going to do this. But in 1959, a country music performer named Johnny Horton released this album through, I think he was Columbia. Yeah, he was Columbia. Columbia. And Horton's song began to reach people and gain popularity very quickly. Horton's song was a cover, actually, of a song written by, does anyone know? Yes, it seems that, yes, Jimmy Driftwood. Jimmy Driftwood, who released this version in 1958, the year before, through RCA Victor. And if anyone wants to have a close look at this later on, I brought it with me. The Jimmy Driftwood, as the man who wrote the song, but not the man that popularized it, I still wanted to mention him, but not just because he was the writer, but because I think he has the best cover art by far. Because look how awesome it is. Here we have, let's just punch in a little bit of General Jackson astride his horse. Ramrod straight barking out orders, and there you see grizzled old Kentucky riflemen sheltering behind cotton bales with apparently jugs of whiskey nearby. And then you see regulars marching up, and then the dogs that are, of course, made famous in the song. To then push on, there's the gator that lost his mind. If you know the song and you know that lyric, which I find especially amusing. A lyric that was obviously meant to get some giggles out of an audience, and it still does to this day. But there he is. And there he is firing his shot and shell toward the fleeing British as they retreat in humiliation and dismay with dogs chasing. And interestingly, the dog is red, which I think is a little bit of an oversight in the album art because it's one of our dogs, right? I mean, the Americans were black, but anyway, without bogging down on that, let's move on. The song, as I mentioned, it gained enormous popularity. Its lyrics are very familiar to us today because of it, and especially this one. They ran through the briars, and they ran through the brambles, they ran through the bushes where the rabbits wouldn't go. They ran so fast that the hounds couldn't catch them down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, is that an accurate portrait of what actually happened? And folks, You heard it here first from me today. It is not an accurate depiction. Believe it or not, neither movies nor television can often provide a decent picture of what happened in history. But when does that ever interfere with anything? When does that ever stop the popularity of things like pop song? And Johnny Horton's version, his cover of Jimmy Driftwood's Battle of New Orleans, shot to the top of the Billboard charts in the year 1959, the #1 song of that year. And that shows you how much popularity there was for it. And no matter how many articles I write, I'm never going to change that. No matter how many articles or books are written by the people in this room are far smarter than me on this subject, we're never going to change this. This was 60 years ago, and you all still remember the lyrics, don't you? And the central argument that I am advancing today is that this song created an historical discourse. And through lyrics like the ones I just showed you about dogs couldn't catch them, my argument is that the discourse created by this song set in motion a distortion of the historical facts about the Battle of New Orleans from 1815. And that is still with us to this very day. Because I find that to this very day, there is still an overwhelming emphasis only on January 8th, 1815, to the complete neglect of the events that occurred before it, and more importantly, the events that occurred after it. And that's what I'd like to talk about in this presentation, the events that occurred after it. Because if you go off of the song, you would think that the United States presided over a resounding and decisive victory, that you would think that the British were soundly routed on January 8th, 1815. And you would think, because the song told you to think this, that the British then retreated down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. And that is not at all what happened. That is not even close to touching on the actuality of what happened, because what actually happened was that the British did not leave. They hung out. They were still, 2 weeks later, still here in the area. 2 weeks later, they were still dangerous. And Jackson was redistributing forces, and Jackson was forced into the redeployment of his troops out of an abundance of caution, out of fear that the British were going to make a second attempt on the city of New Orleans, because he was fully aware that if they did, he might not be able to stop them. They did not run down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. They, in fact, presided over a very complex exfiltration operation that can only be described as wildly successful. And then beyond that exfiltration, they then moved on to the next objective, and the next objective was but a stepping stone on a route to come back to capture the city of New Orleans. But to understand the exfiltration operation, you have to understand the infiltration operation that brought them here to begin with. As you probably all know, they loaded into boats at Cat Island. They then infiltrated in through Lake Bourne to the mouth of Bayou Bienvenue, which was known as Bayou Catalan at the time. Following the bayous brought them inevitably to the plain of Chalmette. This was done in December of 1814, leading to a series of engagements that would ultimately be punctuated by what is certainly the most memorable moment of them all, the January 8th, 1815 battle. And that battle, which is depicted famously in this portrait, which is a thoroughly romanticized view of what happened out there, where we see Andrew Jackson looking very healthy, far healthier than he actually was on that day. But I guess this could be called fake news from the early 19th century. At any rate, the battle was fought. Ron Chapman can explain that better than any living human being, and I'm not going to attempt it. And I'm not really covering that because I'm more interested in what happened afterward. And what happened afterward is set in motion almost immediately. Before the end of the day, on the 8th of January, you might be aware of the fact that a flag of truce came out and General Jackson provided a 2-hour ceasefire during which the British were able to remove their dead. But then I find that will sometimes get mentioned in most retellings, like for the 200th anniversary, did any of you pay attention to bicentennial broadcasts? I did. I paid close attention, maybe a little too close at times, and I was disappointed that, of course, they never ventured beyond midnight on January 8th, 1815. They never ventured into this period that I'm emphasizing. And the period gets kicked off in a dramatic way the next morning on January 9th, when a small task force of 5 Royal Navy ships, I should say gunboats, sail up the Mississippi River to Plaquemine Bend to Fort St. Philip. If you're familiar with Fort St. Philip, it's a masonry fortification that was built between 1792 and 1795 by the Spanish. It then became American territory with the conclusion of the purchase, and the Americans occupy the fort in 1808 and then begin a series of expansions to the fortification where we made it our own. And if you've ever been there, you can still clearly tell what was Spanish construction and what was American construction. But these gunboats sail up to Plaquemine Bend, and from a distance of just over 2 miles, they begin a process of bombarding the garrison at Fort St. Philip, which consisted of 366 Americans. During the next 9 days, these gunboats sit there parked at Plaquemine Bend, bombarding Fort St. Philip. They fire ultimately 1,000 rounds over the course of that 9-day period. That averages out to just over 100 a day. So that's a rather significant bombardment by 19th century terms. This is occurring simultaneous to other very interesting things happening 55 miles to the north, just down the street here, on the plain of Chalmette. Because back here, meanwhile, back at Chalmette, what begins happening is there's a stalemate that unfolds, where there is a cannonade, there are bombardments that occur periodically between the British and the Americans, still manning Line Jackson, with General Lambert occupying his headquarters at the Delaware plantation. And during this time period, there's no immediately noticeable change. And I want to emphasize that to you in the better part of my sermon here to you today about they did not run down the Mississippi River. They did not run for their lives. We did not send them fleeing because there was nothing detectable for days after the battle. Going through the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, it's not until January 15th that we begin to notice that things are changing across the line as the two opposing forces stared across at one another. And this very tenuous, you can't even call it a ceasefire, but this stalemate. Okay, do we have time for a quick aside? Because Sam and I discovered something very interesting earlier. Sometimes people tend to look back at time periods like this and go, oh, everything that needs to be said has long since been said. Everything that needs to be written about the Battle of New Orleans has long since been written. And to that I say no, because last night, in a moment of deep nerd out, I was examining this map, and this map was included as one of the maps in the book Memoir of the War in West Florida and Louisiana by General Jackson's chief engineer, Major Arsène Latour. This map shows us the red splotch up there, which are the main British positions of the plain of Chalmette, and then the map also illustrates the ultimate exfiltration route that is used to such incredible success later on. But here's one thing that, in talking with Dr. Cavell earlier, we realized that no one knows about this and no one has written about it. And if you'll notice, this red line coming down from Chalmette, coming down here all the way to, let's cross over by English Turn, and then patrolling up this way to a stopping point. We realized that no one has investigated this yet, and we don't know what happened and what it looks like. And then we know, too, that they stopped at this point as if they were going to threaten Fort St. Leon and other American forts at this bend in the river. And that at some point, they then followed this retreat line down Bayou Terre-au-Boeuf, all the way out to, if you know the area, Shell Beach and Wyclosky, out to Lake Bourne. And no one's written about this that any of us can come up with. No one knows about this that anyone can come up with. And I now know what's going to happen during my 3 days off in London next month. And I'm going to be at Kew looking at Admiralty records trying to find out, well, what happened here. Because what it looks like to us, we might be proven wrong, but what it looks like to us is that they came up with this idea to attack the forts at this bend of the river from the reverse, potentially opening the way for the Royal Navy ships that were bombarding St. Philip. If they managed to get through, they could continue up. They would have to face opposition at these two forts, but if they were attacked from the rear, maybe that would relieve that opposition, and the ships could come straight through all the way up to Chalmette. So, stay tuned. Maybe I don't think I won't need that long to get to the bottom of this. I think maybe 10 years would do it. So let's meet back here in 2029. I'm going to give you the rest of the story. I'm going to Paul Harvey that for the next decade. Because that's basically what my research projects are running now, 10 years. At any rate, excuse the diversion, but it did fascinate us because I believe this certainly invests great meaning in the notion that we still have so much work to do on this period of time, this period of history, and there is a great example of work yet to be done. All right, now, as I mentioned, it's not until the 15th of January. We are 1 week past the primary engagement on January 8th. 1 week beyond that action. It's only then that the Americans can observe what appears to be a change on the British side of the line as the British are beginning to move to their retreat. That receives some level of confirmation when a deserter comes through the lines that same day and tells the Americans, yes, it looks like we will soon be retreating from the area. So, when that retreat begins, let me put it this way. So January 15th, we start to notice something. On January 17th, a note comes through the lines to General Jackson, and that note announces an interest in establishing a prisoner of war exchange cartel. That cartel meets the following day, January 18, 1815, which coincidentally is the same day that the Royal Navy discontinues its bombardment of Fort St. Philip after 9 days. The prisoner exchange cartel is met during the day on January 18th, wherein 63 prisoners are given back to us. They were prisoners that had been captured in the engagement on December 23, 1814. Then, the following morning, we're now at the morning of January 19th. A note comes through the lines. Another note comes through the lines to General Jackson, and it is from General Lambert. And in that note, he announces that the British are leaving the area, and how courteous it is. Isn't it a fascinating insight into 19th century warfare that General Lambert wishes Jackson to know? I have, to put it in exact quotes, I have relinquished all designs in the city of New Orleans. And the retreat is beginning in earnest at this point. Jackson reacts by sending a detachment of cavalry in pursuit. And this cavalry, as it pursues them briefly, it determines just how extensive, how well laid out and well thought out the line of withdrawal was. Because, I'm going to punch in closer on the map. There you see the main positions. You can see where positions on the west bank were abandoned with a crossover back to British positions on the east bank. You can see then the Villeray Canal. That was where the withdrawal began. As British forces withdrew back along the Villeray Canal, they reached the point where it intersects with Bayou Mazant, where they then built this, exactly how did they word it? It was a strong redoubt with buildings inside of it. Well, the pursuing cavalry chases all the way down past the Delaronde plantation, follows the Villeray Canal, sees that the British have, I can say this, paved the way by using a corduroy road, if you know what I mean, meaning that they cut down small trees and laid out a road so that the troops and the equipment would not bog down. And they took their guns with them. And I don't mean infantry firearms. I don't mean shoulder-fired firearms. I mean, they took their cannon with them on this withdrawal. And so the cavalry pursues to the first redoubt. And when they reach that, they find that there is this significant work here that was described as strong redoubt enclosing huts. The cavalry then continues on along the corduroy road, now on the south side, the south bank of Bayou Mazant, leading all the way up to where it meets Bayou Jumonville, where the British had constructed a boat bridge, allowing their men to cross from one side of the bayou to the other, and that crossing site was under the protection of a breastwork that you can just see there. They continued thenceforth along what is now Bayou Catalan, Bayou Bienvenue, to another boat bridge crossing site, where there was another boat bridge and another breastwork protecting it. And so what this cavalry is realizing as they move through here, the British are gone on January 20th, they're realizing, my God, look what they did. They had to build this road, and then they also protected basically every major critical choke point along that road with these breastworks. They pursued them then beyond this to where the corduroy road went, cut across this bend in Bayou Catalan, and reached what was labeled as a strong work capable of accommodating 1,000 men. And Dr. Cowell and I were looking at the satellite images earlier, and you can still see evidence of this strong redoubt that was built there. When the cavalry reached that point, and where the corduroy road cut across the prairie, they engaged a group of British pickets, who were apparently the last element of this guard force. They exchanged fire with them on January 20th, and they captured 4 of them. But then they pushed on to the strong work capable of accommodating 1,000 men, where they could hear voices, the sun was setting, there was some additional musketry, and they decided to disengage and pull back. And then overnight, the very last element of the British guard force that had been left behind protecting this rat line that allowed them to get out, the very last element of that was put on the boats that night, so that by dawn on January 21st, 1815, the British are gone. Tell that to Jimmy Driftwood and Johnny Horton. So, first of all, we never pursued them down the river. We never pursued them to the Gulf. What we did is we pursued them out through the bayous and marshes east of the city to the shore of Lake Bourne and then to Mississippi Sound. But just for the record, that wasn't much of a pursuit, because it was a small cavalry detachment. And for the small price of 4 prisoners of war, the entirety of Lambert's fighting force had withdrawn from Chalmette and was going back to the transport ships in Mississippi Sound to live and fight another day. This is a narrative that broadly departs from the Jimmy Driftwood, Johnny Horton narrative. And if we had released dogs to chase them, it would have been super easy. Those dogs could have caught them easily, because, hell, on January 22nd, Jackson actually has to make a critical decision on January 22nd, 2 weeks after the battle. And that decision is, do I let people come off of Line Jackson and come into the city? By then, they've been out there since December. They were tired of living out on Line Jackson. And so, Jackson made the decision of letting some of the men come in. He left the 7th Infantry Regiment, U.S. Army Regulars, at Line Jackson 2 weeks after the battle. Those could have been the slowest, oldest dogs on planet Earth, and they could have caught them, because they were in no hurry to leave. 2 weeks later, 14 days later, they're finally gone, but not really, because they withdrew to, you see, the strong breastwork and then the fisherman's village. It was there that they brought in the longboats, and the men loaded up on the boats for the trip back out to Mississippi Sound. And you may have already heard the way that they covered that distance was they rowed across Lake Bourne all the way. It's a distance of about 50 or 60 miles to Cat Island in February. Wouldn't that have been a delightful trip, you know? Just a lot of fun, especially in weather like we had last week. Wouldn't that be just terrific? Well, weather like last week actually cropped up during this critical moment in the history of this battle, because Lambert and Cochrane have everyone fully evacuated from Chalmette by the 22nd. It's only after General Jackson confirmed that they were no longer at Chalmette or anywhere on the exfiltration line, it is only then that he allows this, have you heard of this? On the 23rd at St. Louis Cathedral, they held this service of public thanksgiving. It was only then, on the 23rd of January, that General Jackson realized, okay, thank God, they're gone. We can relax. He wouldn't let the service of public thanksgiving occur before that. And there were no hounds pursuing them, and they weren't running through bushes or briars. Because for more than 2 weeks, they remained here, they remained dangerous, and they were still a threat to the city. Well, when they reach Cat Island, everyone when they get to Cat Island, and everyone has to unload off of the longboats, and they then reorganize for re-embarkation on the big ships. This is completed by the 27th. So then a period of about 3 days is spent reorganizing, making order of what had to have been chaos as the boats came in one by one to Cat Island, and men and equipment unloaded from those boats. They re-embark, they have completed the process of re-embarkation by the 27th, and that same day the weather takes a turn. The weather's turn is so terrible, with high winds, strong seas, heavy rain, sleet in some cases, that they sit anchored at Cat Island for 5 solid days. And through that 5-day period, they're just waiting. The weather finally clears on February 3rd, 1815, and when it clears, they continue onward. And that journey leads them to the east, down the length of Mississippi Sound, toward Dauphin Island in what is now Alabama. They have reached Dauphin Island by February 6th, and this would be the opening move of this new campaign against the city of New Orleans. And the new campaign was going to unfold like this. The force would enter Mobile Bay, they would sail up to Mobile, they would overcome whatever American resistance they encountered there, and in all likelihood, they would overcome it easily, because just for the record, we're not talking about evacuating 500 men or 1,000 men. I don't know if Ron Chapman's in the room, but it is between 5,000 and 7,000 men. So it's not even that you can label this a significant force. This is an overwhelming force, and had it descended on the city of Mobile, it would have swept aside anybody that was in the way. And the plan beyond Mobile was that they would follow the old Spanish trail that led from that city all the way along what is now the Mississippi Gulf Coast. They would have crossed the Pearl River and come back into what is now Louisiana, and they would have then, at that point, confronted 2 possibilities. One could have been that they would cross it past Rigolets and move in toward the city, attacking it from its eastern approaches, which were vulnerable. They could have continued into St. Tammany Parish and maybe done something with boats to move the force across Lake Pontchartrain, attacking the city of New Orleans from its northern approaches, which were the most vulnerable of them all. Or, and this is the option I think was the most likely, they could have continued along where I live, the West Florida Republic, the parishes above the lake. They could have continued to move through St. Tammany and into Tangipahoa and then moved on toward the city of Baton Rouge, and they could have accomplished cutting off New Orleans by simply capturing the city of Baton Rouge, which I think would have been done easily as well, especially with a force this big. Of course, now we know that none of that happens. That's because why? Because we thoroughly beat them and trounced them in open combat? No, because the clock ran out. But let's get to that in just a moment. We got to get them to Mobile. And to get to Mobile, they had to get into Mobile Bay. And to get into Mobile Bay, they had to deal with one little problem. And that little problem was located on the far western end of the peninsula there, Mobile Point. You're seeing in the photograph my first job in public history, which was over 25 years ago, Fort Morgan, Alabama, where I worked as a park ranger for 3 years, which is a 19th century masonry fortification that was permanent and built between 1819 and 1834. But just outside of the walls of Fort Morgan, barely 200 feet from the walls of Fort Morgan, was a structure that was there in February 1815 when the British arrived. And that structure was called Fort Boyer, spelled B-O-Y-E-R here, but actually spelled B-O-W-Y-E-R and pronounced Boyer, with some outbuildings outside of and supporting it. Fort Boyer had been built by the United States government in 1813. And it was fully garrisoned with 375 men from the U.S. Army's 2nd Infantry Regiment. We originally had a plan to make a big, impressive fortification there that would have looked like this. Look how nice, isn't that lovely? Complete with a ditch, with a palisade in the middle of the ditch, mounting 25 guns. Who the hell would dare come into Mobile Bay with that kind of fort? Well, then we ended up with this, because we ran out of money. No ditch, no palisade, 12 guns. And the 12 guns that were in it weren't even all that powerful. But it was nevertheless a thorn. It was an obstacle in the way, and the British could not simply just proceed directly to Mobile. They had to stop and invest this fortification, which they did, beginning on, it's hard to say when it began, because from the commander here was a lieutenant colonel named William T. Lawrence, and Colonel Lawrence first saw them in the afternoon, and as the sun was going down on February 6, 1815, and he noted it. The next day, they set in motion this brilliant campaign that effectively snipped the strings on this fort and castrated it. And here's what they did. That's what Mobile Bay looks like today. I'm going to overlay it with the Latour map. And what you see the British did after unloading a force on Dauphin Island and using it as a base of operation, getting the men the opportunity to get off the ships, because keep in mind, they've been bouncing around on these ships in bad weather since January 27th. They were ready to get off those ships. They get them off the ships, they come up with a plan. That plan is set in motion on February 8th, when you see a series of boats cross Mobile Bay to the north of Fort Boyer. And they do so by reaching delicately around the Porcupine, rather than reaching right into his thorns. They sail well outside of the umbrella of fire that Fort Boyer was capable of putting up to resist them, and they landed 4 miles to the east at a place called Navy Cove. They then landed this significant force. They built huts for them because they knew that this was going to be an investment campaign. They knew that they were going to be there for a while, and it's the most wretched weather in the bleak midwinter that you could imagine. So they build huts for them at Navy Cove. And then they begin the process, with each passing night, of advancing parallels. In other words, advancing trenches toward Fort Boyer. And so for Colonel Lawrence inside Fort Boyer with 275 men, each day and night he watches as the enemy gets closer and closer and closer, and he was helpless to do much about it. Because after all, Fort Boyer, it's a water battery. The guns are oriented toward the channel. They're looking to the west. They're not looking back down the peninsula. Interestingly, almost every piece of this puzzle would be repeated with different antagonists a generation later in 1864, with Confederates in Fort Morgan, Alabama, and with Union forces landing at Navy Cove. But you know what? Maybe we'll talk about that in another presentation. Let's stick to the War of 1812 for now. So as they begin advancing parallels, the first series of parallels are out here on the southern beach, over 400 meters from Fort Boyer. They're capable of delivering a little bit of musket fire, but it's inaccurate musket fire. It's not really meaningful. The British then establish a small picket guard on the beach because they were concerned that what the Americans inside the fort might do is overnight pack the whole thing up and then exfil themselves by walking along the Gulf Beach back out. And by the way, in this image, north is on the bottom of the frame, south is on the top of the frame. But then they came up and built in the sand dunes, only a few hundred meters from the fort. They dig in with artillery, and they brought 14 pieces of artillery. And consider this within the greater imagined universe of Jimmy Driftwood and Johnny Horton. When they left here, with no dogs pursuing them, by the way, they carried out 14 pieces of artillery. That's actually more than 14. I'm leaving out all the little bitty stuff, like the little deck guns, the swivel guns that could be used on the boats. I'm not even mentioning that. I'm mentioning howitzers, mortars, and proper field guns. 14 of them. All had been here at Chalmette, and then poof, ta-da, here they are at Mobile Point, Alabama in February, about to cause a big problem. And on the morning of February 11th, Lawrence awoke to find that overnight, the British, sneaky as they were, had moved along the Gulf Beach, not Gulf Beach, but Bay Beach. This is Mobile Bay, that's the Gulf. They moved along the Bay Beach, covered by sand dunes, by the way, all the way to here, and then they advanced a parallel that did this, and reached all the way up 40 yards from the landward-facing bastion of Fort Boyer. Facing that, the enemy could easily rake the walls of the fort with musket fire, which they were doing from 40 yards away. It can be done with the type of shoulder-fired weapons that were being used in the War of 1812. In assessing the situation, Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence realized it's going to be pointless. Now that they're this close, they can suppress anything that we can do. They've cut off our only avenue of retreat with this picket force along the Gulf Beach. All that I can do is sit here and let them open fire on us with those big guns. And I can't return fire because my guns face to the west, facing the ship channel. And with that as his Sophie's choice, Lawrence ordered a white flag raised in the afternoon of February 11, 1815. He exchanged notes with General Lambert through the lines. And then the following day, February 12, 1815, the garrison of Fort Boyer, all 275 men, marched out, marking the end of the actual last battle of the War of 1812. Not New Orleans. Sometimes, and by the way, disappointingly, many times in television coverage during the Bicentennial, it was listed and described as the final battle of the War of 1812. And I don't consider it that, because this happens before Valentine's Day. There were other actions that stretched beyond this, but to me, this is the last true battle because it's a major operation. Whenever you have an operation that's involving nearly 10,000 people, that's a major operation. And that's what this was. Major Lawrence and his men marched out on the 12th. During the day on the 13th, they began the process of processing these men so that they could be subsequently paroled. And the process of organizing the paroles for the men was then interrupted on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1815, when HMS Brazen pulled up and sent a note ashore that announced the war has been over since Christmas Eve. And at that point, this entire new campaign that would have brought war back to Louisiana, that would have brought a new threat to the city of New Orleans, with that new campaign was washed away and done for and did not actually happen. So it's not like Jimmy Driftwood and Johnny Horton told you at all, is it? This is an enemy that remained dangerous and wasn't going away. This is an enemy that experienced a setback. I'm not going to call it a minor setback, but a meaningful setback on January 8th on the plain of Chalmette. And this same enemy is here 40 days later, accepting the surrender of an American garrison, showing that this force, not only did they not flee in disarray, not only were they not dealt an humiliating rout at Chalmette, this same force then extricated itself very carefully from around New Orleans, re-embarked on board ships, went to Mobile Point, Alabama, and delivered one final victory for king and country. On the 17th of February, the Treaty of Ghent was fully ratified by the Senate of the United States in a unanimous vote. A Senate that went, thank God, we got out of this a lot better than we ever dreamed we were going to get out of this. And President Madison was so happy to sign it and have the issue sorted out that he signed it the same day and put it in the hands of Chargé d'Affaires Anthony St. John Baker, the man that had been sent to Washington to conclude the matter on behalf of the Crown. 41 days after the January 8th, 1815 engagement at Chalmette that we know as the Battle of New Orleans. And so when you look at a popular song, there's part of the treaty, by the way, showing ratification on February 17th by the U.S. Senate. So when you closely examine the events that are subsequent to January 8th, a totally different story is revealed to you. Johnny Horton would ultimately release a best-of album, his greatest hits album, that he rather bombastically titled, Johnny Horton Makes History. And my central argument is that, yes, together with Jimmy Driftwood, they did make history. By creating a heavily distorted and factually incorrect discourse about the Battle of New Orleans, where it became something that could be celebrated as a resounding victory, which it really was not. It was a victory, yes, but it was not as simple as they made it sound. It was far more complicated than that, and they dealt a setback to an enemy who simply moved on and would have come back for more and would have been back here again if it had not been for the Treaty of Ghent. And I thank you for listening to the presentation.
No questions?
Okay. All right, just one.
One question.
Okay. All right. How about 3 questions? That's it. See, I fold too easily, don't I?
Jawohl. You have a question, sir?
Yes.
You in the Rolling Stones shirt. You have a question?
British invasion. My question is, the 14 pieces of artillery you said they brought to Mobile, okay, and we think of artillery at Waterloo, was there any traditional artillery on the British side at the Battle of New Orleans? Any wheeled?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I'm not really sure about everything that they had here. I can definitely speak to the 14 weapons that were at Mobile Point at Fort Boyer, and that was, I know it was 2 mortars. They were 8-inch mortars, which by the standards of the War of 1812, that's an appreciably large weapon. That those I think weighed about 650 pounds. So just imagine what a nightmare it would have been to move those. Those were not wheeled pieces. They were on. Have you ever seen how like a Coehorn mortar from the Civil War is on a solid wood? It's like a chassis. It's not a wheeled carriage. But in addition to that, he had 8 howitzers, which would have been not 6 pounds, 4 pounds. He had 8 4-pound howitzers, which were wheeled short-barreled weapons that had been here and then showed up at Mobile Point. And then he finally had, so that's, oh, and then he had 4 5-inch, no, not 5-inch, 4-inch guns. And you understand the distinction being howitzer, mortar, short-barrel weapon, indirect fire. Howitzer, between that and a gun, howitzer meaning an intermediate length barrel on a wheeled carriage, and then a gun being a weapon with a tube length greater than 5 times the diameter of the shot. And that would be capable of indirect fire, but also function very effectively with direct fire. And all 14 of those weapons had been here before being taken to Mobile. So it's a significant amount of artillery. Yes, sir.
I recently reread a book called The British at the Gates by Robert Riley. And one of the points that he made is that he thought that if we attacked on Fort St. Philip had been made earlier, it would have encountered less resistance because Jackson had come into town and really beefed up the defenses of New Orleans. And the work would have been completed if the British had tried to had attacked it early.
Interesting idea. I'm not so sure about that because that garrison was there before December. That garrison moved into position there because it was known when the British when they reach out to Jean Lafitte on Grand Terre Island, Barataria Bay, before it all starts. We knew that they were there. We had a pretty good idea what they were up to, and we had already garrisoned Fort St. Philip. As to the timing of that, I'm not sure that timing would have made much of a difference. But what it is now looking like after this thing that I mentioned that Dr. Cowell and I were discussing earlier, it's now appearing that they had a multi-part plan, and that the multi-part plan was the main body would infiltrate in through the bayous and swamps to the east of the city. Royal Navy would come up through the river, and that this other force moved along potentially to reduce the fortifications that were, the fortification at Fort St. Leon. But that's a pending story, and I don't know, well, those forts were all garrisoned as of December, so I don't know that timing would have made a big difference, but it's still an interesting idea to mull over, and I'll be doing that tonight. Yes, sir. Oh yeah, wait, here, yes, right in front. Yes, ma'am.
Just in defense of Driftwood in Horton. Driftwood was a Arkansas history teacher, and he wrote the Battle of New Orleans song to get his students interested in history. Horton heard it, and the rest is history.
Right, and look how successful he was. I mean, my God, it's 6 decades later and we know the song still. Name other songs from the year 1959. Well, it might be unfair if you were alive and well then, but I can't. I certainly can't. But and I do poke fun at Driftwood and Horton in that they did. Yeah, there's much more to the story, and of course, it always requires the nerd historian with his glasses that has to point out. Well, actually, you'll find that you're always going to have an historian doing that. But really what they did, if the objective was, as we've always understood it to be, to get his students interested in history, look at how well he succeeded. He produced a #1 hit for 1959. Yes, sir, in the back.
You're aware that Jackson wrote to Claiborne on January the 19th declaring victory and requesting a celebration at St. Louis Cathedral?
Right, I think it's fascinating that Jackson does that, declaring victory on the 19th, 11 days after the main battle, and that while the same day that he's doing that, which is the day that the cavalry pursuit occurred, the brief cavalry pursuit, the same day he's doing that, he redeployed forces, he gave permission for some men to go home, retained 7th Infantry Regiment at Line Jackson, so he was ready to announce victory, but at the same time, he wanted the regulars to stay there. So I think that although he was ready, he was confident that they were gone and that it was over, he was still a little bit gun shy, and he still knew that they were out there and they were still dangerous, as the garrison at Fort Boyer would testify to.
Since I lost control, one last question. Please ask it and I'll leave you on it.
That cavalry that followed the British down the Corduroy Road to Lake Bourne, how many men was that?
That's just it. So it was 2 colonels, and then Major Hines was the detachment commander, and I've heard that that was less than 30 men. So it was not a meaningful force. And this is where, if I were to offer a criticism, far be it from me to criticize decisions that were made 204 years ago, but if there is one criticism that could be made, it's that there was no meaningful effort made to pursue the enemy after January 8th. That is, after January 8th, we sat back and watched them, let them make some mistakes, and then Jackson stood there and went, "Oh no, we're not gonna go out and lose now. We've let them mistake themselves into handing us a victory. Stand back and let them do what they're going to do. They're going to go away, maybe, but let's see." Yeah, exactly. They outnumbered Line Jackson. My God, then look at how they overwhelmed the 275 men at Fort Boyer with a force of, we still can't figure out an exact number, but it's more than 5,000 men, and that's not counting the people on the ships. That could also be a part of the battle as well. That's what pushes this up to approaching 10,000 people. So you got 10,000 people out there, and they have one job, and that is capture New Orleans. And so yes, there was a celebration at St. Louis Cathedral. Yes, Jackson announced victory, but in that era when we still didn't know that this war was going to end, yes, the treaty had been signed, but that didn't mean anything until full Senate ratification, and there was no sign that that was going to happen anytime soon. There was still something to be scared of with this force, which so fundamentally complicates what Driftwood and Horton had to say. I'm sorry to beat the dead horse, but there it is again. All right, everybody, thanks.